In the high-stakes world of corporate power, Mark Sullivan stood at the top, untouchable in his empire. The CEO of Anexa Solutions, a tech giant, had led the company to unimaginable heights. With a mind sharpened by years of fierce competition, he held a reputation that was both revered and feared. His employees whispered about him behind closed doors, known for his relentless pursuit of success at all costs. To Mark, the rules of business were simple: get results or get out. Loyalty meant nothing. Emotions were for the weak. People were merely tools, valuable only when they served the company's bottom line. Mark knew this better than anyone. He had ruthlessly fired employees who didn't meet his expectations without a second thought. He had built his empire on the back of those he had cast aside, but no one dared challenge him. His cold, calculated approach had earned him both admiration and fear. Among the many employees who had worked tirelessly for Mark, there was one who had stood out, a woman who had poured her heart and soul into the company for nearly a decade. Her name was Sarah Matthews, and she was a bright, talented project manager who had earned the respect of her peers and superiors alike. Her work ethic was unmatched, and her dedication was unparalleled. Sarah had sacrificed time, energy, and personal moments for the success of the company she had grown to love. She had made Anexa her second home. Mark respected her work, though he never showed it, always too focused on the bigger picture to acknowledge the ones who made it all happen. Sarah had been part of Anexa for almost 10 years. When she started, she was a young, eager professional, but now she was pregnant with her first child. She had worked hard to keep up with the demands of the job, often putting her personal life on hold to ensure the company's success. And now, as she stood before her colleagues one Tuesday morning, announcing the news that she was expecting, she felt a wave of joy and anticipation wash over her. Her colleagues erupted in applause, cheering her on with genuine excitement and joy. But as Sarah looked across the room at her boss, Mark, she saw something different, a cold, almost calculating look in his eyes. Mark had always been a man of business, not one for emotions, but this time it was different. There was something unsettling about the way he watched her, as if her pregnancy, the very thing that should be celebrated, had made her a liability in his eyes. His smile was stiff, forced, and he quickly moved on to the next topic, clearly uninterested in her news. But Sarah, still caught up in the excitement of the moment, didn't think much of it. She returned to her seat, feeling a mix of happiness and nerves. She had always known the corporate world wasn't kind to women, especially when it came to maternity leave, but she hoped that Anexa, under Mark's leadership, would be different. After all, hadn't she given everything to the company? In the days following her announcement, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Mark had congratulated her in passing, but it was always brief, cold, nothing like the warmth she had expected. He never asked about her well-being, about the baby. As the days passed, Sarah noticed the shift in his attitude. She was no longer seen as the dedicated employee she had once been. She could feel the tension building between them, a palpable change in the way Mark treated her. She began to wonder if her pregnancy had already made her a burden in his eyes. Behind closed doors in the executive meetings, Mark had begun to express his true feelings about Sarah's announcement. As his top leadership team sat around the table, Mark's voice was sharp and cutting. "This is a business, not a daycare," he said, his words dripping with disdain. "Maternity leave, reduced efficiency, temporary replacements. It's a liability we can't afford right now, especially not when the market is tightening." The room fell silent. No one dared challenge Mark. He was a man whose word was law. His team had learned long ago not to question him, and today no one spoke up. Mark had made his decision. Sarah would be the first to go. She wasn't performing to his standards anymore, and he had already decided that her pregnancy made her a risk to the company's bottom line. There was no room for compassion in Mark's world. He leaned back in his chair and looked out the window, lost in thought. A few of the executives exchanged uneasy glances, but they remained silent, knowing better than to speak up. Mark's decisions were final. He had always been this way, cutthroat, efficient, with no room for weakness. "Let's frame it as restructuring," he suggested, a cruel smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Cutting a few positions will look strategic to the stakeholders. We can do this by the end of the week." And just like that, Sarah's fate was sealed. The decision had been made, and the ruthless CEO had no intention of backing down. He was a man who got what he wanted, no matter the cost. The next day, Sarah received a call to Mark's office. She walked in, unsure of what was coming. She had been with the company for nearly a decade. Loyal, hardworking, always delivering above expectations. But as she sat down in front of Mark's imposing desk, she could feel the weight of what was about to happen. "Sarah," Mark began, his voice devoid of any empathy, "I want to start by saying how much we value the contributions you've made to this company. But due to recent restructuring decisions, we're having to eliminate a few roles. And unfortunately, yours is one of them." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her heart raced, and for a moment, she couldn't process what was happening. She had given everything to this company, and now, in an instant, it was all being taken away from her. "But I've been here for almost 10 years, Sarah stammered, struggling to make sense of what was happening. "My track record, my work, it's not about performance." Mark didn't even let her finish. He interrupted smoothly, his tone cold and detached. "It's about the bigger picture, Sarah," he said, his words final. "I'm sorry, but this is how it has to be." As Sarah packed her things, tears blurred her vision. She had no idea what her future held. How could she go on after this? After all the years of dedication, how could one man's cold, calculated decision change her life in a matter of minutes? When Sarah came home that evening and told Daniel, her husband, about what had happened, his face darkened. He listened to her, his jaw tightening with an unspoken determination. The injustice of it all was too much for him to bear. "We'll get through this," Daniel said firmly, though his voice was tinged with anger. "But first, we need to focus on what matters. Your health, the baby. We'll figure this out, and we will fight back. Mark Sullivan won't get away with this." To Daniel, the injustice wasn't just about losing Sarah's job. It was about the principle of it all. People like Mark thought they could ruin lives with one decision, but Daniel was determined to show him that loyalty, hard work, and compassion were not things that could be thrown away so easily. In the days that followed, Sarah channeled all her energy into preparing for their child. But the injustice of Mark's actions lingered, an ever-present reminder of the cold, heartless nature of the corporate world. As the baby's arrival drew closer, Sarah began to wonder if Mark's ruthless tactics would ever come back to haunt him. Weeks passed, and Sarah Matthews, though still reeling from the shock of losing her job, began to find a semblance of peace. The birth of her child was approaching, and as much as she tried to focus on the future, the sting of betrayal never quite left. Daniel, her husband, had become her rock, always by her side, reassuring her that this was just a chapter, one that was about to turn. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that there was more at play here. Mark Sullivan's decision to fire her wasn't just about business strategy. It wasn't even about the company's future. It was personal. He saw her pregnancy as a weakness, a liability, and that hurt more than anything. He had underestimated her, though, and she wasn't going to let it go. Not now, and not ever. One crisp autumn morning, Sarah sat in the living room, rocking gently in the armchair by the window, her baby daughter Emma asleep in her arms. The soft, steady rhythm of the rocker calmed her nerves as she watched the world outside. The world she had once been part of. The corporate world that had cast her aside without a second thought. She still couldn't believe it. How easily Mark had dismissed her. How easily the company she had given her heart to had let her go. But there was no time for self-pity now. Her daughter needed her strength, and so did her husband. "Sarah," Daniel called from the other room, pulling her away from her thoughts. "Come here. You've got to see this." Curious, Sarah stood up carefully and walked to the study. Daniel sat at his desk, staring at the screen, his eyes wide. "This just broke," he said, turning the monitor toward her. The headline read, "Inexa Solutions acquired by new investment group." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had heard rumors of the company being sold, but she had no idea it would happen so quickly. And yet something in her gut told her that this news was far from coincidental. Daniel read aloud, "We are excited to usher in a new era for Inexa Solutions," he said, quoting the spokesperson. "And with that, we are pleased to introduce the company's new CEO." His voice trailed off, disbelief in his eyes as the screen revealed the name of the new leader, Daniel Matthews. Sarah's eyes widened in shock. She knew that Daniel had been an investor in the tech industry, but she had never imagined this. Not like this. Daniel, her quiet, steady husband, the man who had always been behind the scenes, was now standing at the helm of the very company that had wronged her. In that moment, everything changed. Mark Sullivan sat in his office, his fingers tapping restlessly against the polished wood of his desk. He had just finished a meeting with his board members. The tone in the room had shifted in recent weeks, and he could feel the pressure mounting. It wasn't just about the company anymore. It was about the board, the investors, and the looming threat of losing control of his own empire. He watched as Daniel Matthews, the new CEO of Anexa Solutions, stood confidently in front of the board members, introducing himself with a calm yet undeniable authority. Mark's chest tightened. He had always prided himself on his leadership, on his ability to steer the company towards success. But now it was clear that he was no longer in control. "We're in a new era now," Daniel's voice echoed through the room, a firm contrast to Mark's cold, calculating tone. "This company's leadership will no longer be defined by profits alone. We will build something different here, something that values its people." Mark's face drained of color. He knew exactly who Daniel was speaking to, and he knew that his days were numbered. As Daniel took the stage during the press conference, Mark's mind raced. He had built his reputation on cutting people off, on making the tough decisions. But Daniel wasn't making those decisions for the same reasons Mark did. Daniel wasn't motivated by power. He was motivated by fairness and empathy. "Leadership isn't just about market dominance," Daniel had said during the conference, his words like daggers aimed directly at Mark. "It's about valuing the people who make those successes possible." Mark could hear the silence in the room, the tension that hung in the air. He realized with a gut-wrenching certainty that Daniel was not only taking control of Anexa Solutions, he was taking everything Mark had worked for. The company, the employees, the respect, everything was slipping through his fingers. He had underestimated Daniel, and now it was too late. The changes began almost immediately. Daniel's first executive decision was to overhaul the company's culture. He wasn't just about business efficiency. He was about creating a company that employees would be proud to work for, a company where people were valued not just for their results, but for their humanity. Sarah's return to the company was an announcement that sent shockwaves through Anexa Solutions. As the employees gathered in the conference room for Daniel's first major company-wide meeting, Sarah stood beside him, her head held high. The applause that followed was deafening, not just because she had been reinstated, but because of the message it sent. Sarah had been wronged, and now she was back where she belonged, leading with the integrity that the company had lacked under Mark's leadership. Daniel addressed the room, his voice strong and unwavering. "Today marks the beginning of a new chapter," he said. "We're committed to building a workplace where everyone feels supported and respected. And part of that commitment is recognizing the people who've been integral to the success of this company." With that, he turned to Sarah. "Sarah Matthews has been a cornerstone of this company's success for nearly a decade," he said, his pride evident. "Her dedication, her contributions, they deserve not just recognition, but trust." The room erupted into applause once again as Sarah took the stage, a tear in her eye. The cheers of her colleagues filled the room, a stark contrast to the cold, corporate indifference she had faced only months before. Daniel had given her the respect she deserved, and in doing so, he had transformed Anexa Solutions into something more than just a company. It was a family, a community where empathy and respect were the cornerstones of success. As Sarah looked out over the room, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had come full circle. The betrayal she had faced had only made her stronger, and now with her family by her side, she was ready to take on the challenges ahead. For Mark, it was the end of an era. His departure from Anexa Solutions was swift, his resignation letter a mere formality. The board had pushed him out, unable to ignore the growing discontent among the employees. Mark had been forced to step down, his fall from grace as swift as his rise had been. The very tactics he had relied on to climb to the top had been his undoing. For Daniel and Sarah, it was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter where integrity, empathy, and leadership guided the way. The company was flourishing, and with the new changes in place, the employees knew they had a CEO who would fight for them, who would ensure that their voices were heard and that their well-being mattered. As Sarah cradled Emma in her arms that evening, she looked at Daniel and smiled. "We did it," she said softly. "We've made a difference." Daniel's eyes met hers, filled with gratitude and pride. "We've just begun," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. The journey had been long, filled with betrayal, struggle, and heartache. But in the end, it had been worth it. They had turned a company built on ruthless tactics into one driven by empathy and integrity. And in doing so, they had changed not just their own lives, but the lives of everyone around them. So the final lesson. This story isn't just about a woman who was wronged or a man who rose to power. It's about the power of standing up for what's right, even when the odds are against you. It's about the strength to rise above adversity, to fight for fairness and compassion in a world that often values profit over people. As Sarah and Daniel looked at their daughter, they knew that they had created a future worth fighting for, a future where empathy wasn't a weakness, but a strength, a future where people were valued not just for what they could do, but for who they were. And as the sun set on Anexa Solutions, the company stood as a testament to what could be achieved when integrity and compassion led the way.